When you think of the First World War, you probably think of its shocking brutality and this staggering loss of life. But what if I told you that the very same conflict that caused this massive medical crisis also sparked a medical revolution? That's the incredible story we're exploring today. How unimaginable suffering forced us to take these giant leaps forward in the art of healing.
It's a wild paradox, isn't it? How could a war that killed millions also become the very thing that pushed life-saving breakthroughs forward? Let's dig in and unpack how the battlefield became this totally unlikely laboratory for modern medicine. So, here's our game plan. We'll start by setting the stage, then we'll dive into the horrific conditions and injuries soldiers were up against. From there, we'll look at the incredible innovations that came out of the chaos. And finally, we'll see what kind of lasting legacy all this left on the world of medicine. To really get a grip on the medical revolution, you first have to understand the war itself. And believe me, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. So when war kicked off in 1914, Europe basically split down the middle into two huge alliances. You had the Entente powers, that's Britain, France, and their allies, squaring off against the Central Powers, led by Germany. This wasn't just some regional tiff, this was a full-blown global conflict that pulled in millions of people and created a medical crisis on a scale nobody was prepared for. And this wasn't a war of quick, clever victories. No way. It just bogged down into this brutal, grinding war of attrition. The whole grim point wasn't just about capturing a town or a hill. It was about bleeding the other side dry, just inflicting the maximum number of casualties day after day. A strategy like that guarantees a constant, overwhelming flood of wounded men. And this right here, this is why it was so deadly. Modern industrial technology had created a whole new kind of battlefield. You had soldiers trapped in these endless, muddy trench systems, facing down machine guns, seas of barbed wire, and a constant, earth-shattering rain of heavy artillery. These new weapons didn't just kill, they maimed and wounded people in ways that were just completely new and horrific. So what did this new kind of war actually mean for the soldiers in the trenches and for the medics desperately trying to patch them up? Well, it was nothing short of a medical nightmare. The environment itself was a weapon. I mean, soldiers were standing for weeks on end in cold, waterlogged trenches. This led to a condition called trench foot. And it's as awful as it sounds. Your flesh would literally start to rot off your bones. It was a horrifying condition that could easily lead to amputation. And it wasn't just the mud and water. The trenches were absolutely infested with lice. And these lice spread something called trench fever. This nasty disease could knock a soldier out of the fight for months at a time. It just goes to show the smallest creatures could be just as dangerous as an enemy bullet. And then, at the Battle of Ypres, a terrifying new weapon was unleashed: poison gas. First, there was chlorine gas, which basically suffocated soldiers by burning their lungs from the inside out. Then came the even more horrific mustard gas. This stuff caused these agonizing blisters, not just on your skin, but in your eyes, all through your throat and lungs. Doctors were suddenly facing injuries they had absolutely no idea how to even begin to treat. But the damage wasn't just physical. The relentless, crushing stress of this new industrial warfare waged a brutal war on the minds of the soldiers too. They called it shell shock. You have to imagine the constant threat of death, the never-ending noise of artillery, seeing things no human should ever have to see. It shattered men. It left them with uncontrollable tremors, unable to speak, sometimes completely paralyzed. It was a deep, invisible wound, and one that almost no one understood at the time. At special hospitals like Seal Hain, doctors were trying to figure this out. Some of their treatments were actually pretty progressive, like talking therapies, but others were brutal. They used things like electric shock therapy because they thought the trauma was some kind of physical problem with the nerves. It just starkly shows you how unprepared the medical world was for the psychological price of modern war. But here's where the story takes a turn. Out of this absolute crisis, this unimaginable suffering, came incredible ingenuity. Faced with challenges they couldn't have even dreamed of, doctors and surgeons were forced to innovate at lightning speed. So, the first huge challenge was the devastating facial injuries from shrapnel and bullets. In response, a surgeon named Harold Gillies didn't just treat the wounds, he essentially invented the entire field of modern plastic surgery, right there in the war. He developed these unbelievable new techniques to literally rebuild men's faces, giving thousands of disfigured soldiers a chance to have a normal life again. In the filth of the trenches, any wound was almost guaranteed to get infected. The soil was full of germs like tetanus and gangrene. The Carroll-Dakin method was a total game changer. It was so simple, yet so brilliant. They would stick tubes deep into a wound and then just constantly flush it with an antiseptic solution. It systematically cleaned it out, stopping deadly infections before they could take hold. It saved countless limbs and countless lives. Soldiers were bleeding to death before they could even get to a hospital. The big breakthrough came at the Battle of Cambrai in 1917. Doctors figured out that adding a simple chemical, sodium citrate, to blood stopped it from clotting. This one discovery was massive. It meant that for the first time ever, blood could be stored and transported. This led to the world's first blood banks, and it made life-saving transfusions possible right near the front lines. It's amazing how sometimes the simplest solutions have the biggest impact. Before the war, if a soldier broke their femur, their thigh bone, they had an 80% chance of dying. 80%! Then came the Thomas splint, basically a simple metal frame that held the leg still for transport. This one simple device dropped the death rate from 80% all the way down to 20%. Just an unbelievable, revolutionary invention. Brain surgery was a whole other challenge. Shrapnel caused so many head wounds, and trying to pull tiny bits of metal out of a living brain was incredibly risky. But a surgeon named Harvey Cushing had this brilliant idea. Why not use a magnet? He could use it to draw the metal fragments out, which allowed for way more precision and gave his patients a much better shot at survival. And sometimes the solutions came from the most unexpected and kind of gross places. When antiseptics weren't around or just weren't working, some doctors turned to nature. They figured out that maggots would only eat the dead infected tissue in a wound, cleaning it out perfectly and stopping the spread of infection. I know, it sounds grim, but hey, it worked. So what's the big picture here? What does this all add up to? Well, the war eventually ended, but these medical advancements, they stuck around. And they went on to shape the world we live in today. Now, for anyone studying this period, especially for the Edexcel curriculum, these are the points you really need to remember. The First World War was this incredibly powerful catalyst for medical progress. The sheer scale and brutality of it all forced rapid innovation. From plastic surgery to blood banks, so many of the techniques that were pioneered in the trenches are still fundamental parts of medicine today. It's a tragic truth that war has often been a key driver of medical change. When you boil it all down, the story of medicine in World War I is a story of acceleration. The immense pressure and the extreme conditions of the war literally compressed what might have taken decades of medical progress into just 4 incredibly intense, revolutionary years. And that kind of leaves us with one final big question. If conflict was such a powerful engine for innovation, what are the great challenges that will push medicine forward in times of peace? It's a really vital question for all of us to think about.